Most people remember the American Revolution as a loud and crowded story. Redcoats lining up in neat rows, muskets cracking the air with smoke and thunder, angry colonists shouting about liberty, famous names delivering words that feel polished and permanent, as if history itself paused to listen. It is a story told so often that it begins to feel complete, sealed, finished, nothing more to question, nothing left in the shadows. But history rarely works that way. It does not lie so much as it simplifies. Over time, complexity is trimmed away, not out of malice, but out of convenience. Loud moments survive, quiet ones fade. What remains is a version that fits comfortably into memory, even if it leaves something essential behind. Revolutions, in particular, resist being simple. They are not single storms, but entire seasons of pressure, building in many places at once. While attention stayed fixed on familiar images along the eastern seaboard, other movements were unfolding beyond the edges of popular imagination. Decisions were being made far from crowded streets and famous halls. They did not arrive with speeches or banners. They moved slowly, quietly, carried by geography, fear, and calculation. These choices left no dramatic portraits behind them, which made them easy to forget, easy too to underestimate. The traditional story of independence suggests that victory followed bravery, sacrifice, and destiny moving in a straight line. It implies clarity, as though everyone involved understood what was happening and why. Yet most people living through upheaval rarely feel clarity. They feel uncertainty. They feel tension without knowing where it leads. Power often shifts not where cannons fire, but where attention is absent, where decisions can be made without witnesses. This is where the familiar narrative begins to thin. Beneath the celebrated struggle lies a colder layer of conflict, shaped not by applause or outrage, but by patience. While battles burned brightly in public view, another contest unfolded beyond it, one concerned less with independence as an idea and more with control as a reality. It was quieter, slower, and far more strategic. No textbooks linger there, no monuments mark its turning points. That absence is not accidental. History remembers what can be easily shown, not what must be carefully traced. When later generations looked back, they followed the noise. The silence remained unexamined. This documentary does not begin by tearing down heroes or rewriting dates. It asks something gentler, but more unsettling. What if the outcome of the revolution depended on forces that never sought recognition? What if the most decisive choices were made where no one thought to look? Not in crowded cities or on famous fields, but in spaces defined by distance, cold, and uncertainty. Once that possibility is allowed, even briefly, the familiar story loosens its grip. The war most people recognize becomes only the surface of something deeper. Beneath it lies a parallel struggle, unfolding patiently, shaping outcomes without ever announcing itself. To understand how a nation was born, it is not enough to revisit the moments that demanded attention. We must also follow the ones that avoided it. And that journey begins by looking away from where history tells us to look, and toward the places it taught us to ignore. Certainty is comforting, especially late at night when stories are meant to settle the mind rather than disturb it. Yet true understanding often begins with discomfort, with the quiet realization that something familiar may be incomplete. If the revolution was not decided only where cannons sounded and crowds gathered, then its decisive moments must be searched for elsewhere, somewhere quieter, somewhere less obvious. The question shifts almost on its own. If the struggle that shaped independence was not fully visible, where everyone was watching, then where was it actually taking place? The answer waits beyond memory. In landscapes history preferred to leave silent, distant, cold, and deliberately unexplored entirely. Maps have a way of shaping belief. What they include feels important. What they exclude feels irrelevant. The northern frontier rarely draws the eye in familiar tellings of the revolution. It appears distant, pale, almost unfinished, as if nothing worth recording happened there. Wide spaces, thin lines, unnamed regions. The quiet seems natural, but quiet is not the same as empty. This land was not silent by accident. It was silent by design. Dense forests absorbed sound and movement alike. Rivers froze for months, then vanished beneath fog when they thawed. Paths existed only briefly, before weather erased them. Settlements were scattered and fragile, more rumor than certainty, Even presence itself was temporary. People arrived, adapted, disappeared. In such a place, nothing lingered long enough to become visible. Maps could not capture this well, and so they simplified it. The North became background, a margin around the real story. Yet margins are where adjustments are made, where errors are corrected without notice. The environment resisted order. Armies struggled to move. Messages travelled slowly, if they arrived at all. News dissolved into uncertainty before it reached distant ears. Deaths went uncounted. Agreements formed and collapsed without record. What could not be tracked could not be celebrated, but it also could not be challenged. This was not a place suited for spectacle. It was suited for patience. Influence could drift here without leaving footprints. Decisions could be tested quietly, adjusted, abandoned, and tried again. The lack of witnesses was not a flaw. It was protection. Invisibility became its own form of cover. Power learned to operate here not by occupying space, but by shaping conditions. The cold helped. Distance helped more. Silence allowed actions to feel like accidents. Outcomes appeared natural, inevitable, unauthored. When no one sees the moment a decision is made, the result feels like fate. The northern frontier mastered this illusion. Geography did the work of concealment better than secrecy ever could. What looks like neglect from afar begins to resemble strategy up close. The quieter the region, the fewer questions it inspired. Attention followed warmth, crowds, and speeches. Meanwhile, beyond the edges of focus, balance shifted. Control was not asserted with banners, but with absence. The land itself filtered who could pass, who could remain, who could communicate. Strategy merged with terrain until they were indistinguishable. To later generations, the North seemed unimportant because it left so little behind. No iconic battles, no ringing declarations, only faint traces scattered across cold ground. But that scarcity of memory is the clue. It suggests a place where influence preferred not to be seen, where visibility itself was a liability. Consider how memory works. Events that announce themselves loudly demand to be remembered. Those that unfold slowly, without spectacle, slip past the mind. The northern frontier encouraged forgetting, even as it absorbed consequence. Time moved differently there. Seasons decided more than orders ever did. Waiting became normal, uncertainty became routine. In such conditions, endurance mattered more than declaration. Whoever understood that rhythm could shape outcomes without appearing to act at all. Silence did not mean inactivity. It meant work carried out beneath awareness, guided by restraint, timing, and the knowledge that what remains unseen is often hardest to resist. Here, absence was not weakness. It was leverage, refined and carefully maintained. Over time, once that idea settles, the silence begins to speak. The empty spaces on the map feel intentional. The lack of detail feels deliberate. Geography stops being neutral and starts behaving like a participant. It shaped what could happen and, just as importantly, what could be hidden. If an entire struggle unfolded beyond notice, it did so because conditions allowed it. Someone understood that obscurity offered safety. Someone benefited from quiet more than noise. And if silence itself functioned as a weapon, then the question can no longer be avoided. Who, exactly, needed this northern war to remain unseen? Revolutions appear singular only in hindsight. When remembered later, they compress into one conflict with one purpose, one beginning, one end. But while they are unfolding, revolutions are rarely unified events. They are stacks of struggles happening at the same time, each pulling in different directions, each competing for influence over what the outcome will eventually mean. The loudest struggle often becomes the story. The quieter ones become the structure beneath it. Empires understand this instinctively. They almost never fight a single war at a time. While cannons thunder in one place, calculations unfold elsewhere. While rebellion draws attention, negotiations slip forward unnoticed. The visible conflict becomes a distraction, not because it is unimportant, but because it absorbs focus. Beneath it, other contests move slowly, shaping terms rather than victories. During the push for independence, rebellion dominated the imagination. It was emotional, dramatic, easy to frame. But alongside it ran other tensions, colder, and more deliberate. Borders mattered. Trade routes mattered. Access mattered. Control over future movement mattered most of all. These struggles did not need crowds or speeches. They required patience and positioning. They unfolded where headlines could not reach. Different groups carried different expectations of independence. Some saw freedom as separation, others saw it as adjustment. Some feared what independence might unleash once the shared enemy vanished. These competing visions did not collide in open battle. They met quietly, in decisions about land, access, and obligation. The northern frontier became a place where those visions could be tested without forcing resolution in public view. Here, war stopped looking like armies facing each other. It began to resemble negotiation without visibility. Influence shifted through promises, hesitations, temporary arrangements, and carefully timed silence. Choices were made not to win the present, but to shape the future. In these quieter conflicts, success meant defining limits rather than claiming glory. This is where inevitability dissolves. Independence feels predestined when viewed only through open rebellion. But beneath that surface lay conditions that could have nudged the outcome in different directions. Nothing was fully decided until it was made difficult to undo. And difficulty rarely comes from force alone. It comes from structure, from agreements that seem minor until they harden, from pathways quietly closed while attention looks elsewhere. The northern conflict was not fought to decide whether independence would occur, but what kind of independence would survive. That distinction mattered more than battles. Control over borders determined growth. Control over trade shaped stability. Control over uncertainty influenced who could act freely and who could not. These decisions did not announce themselves as victories. They settled in quietly and waited. What history often calls unity was, in reality, coexistence under tension. Forces with incompatible goals learned to move without confronting each other directly. Avoidance replaced confrontation. Delay replaced resolution. In that space, power accumulated without exposure. The absence of open conflict allowed incompatible interests to remain unresolved while still shaping outcomes. This layered war required a different kind of participant. Not soldiers, but intermediaries. Not generals, but negotiators. Not speeches, but timing. The northern silence offered the perfect environment for such work. There was room to maneuver without being seen, to adjust course without explanation. The lack of witnesses protected the process. When later generations searched for causes, they followed the obvious trail. Battles left marks, words survived on paper. Quiet adjustments left nothing that demanded remembrance. Yet those adjustments narrowed possibilities long before anyone realized choices were disappearing. Independence emerged not as a sudden break, but as a negotiated condition bounded by decisions already absorbed into the landscape. Once this is understood, the revolution stops feeling like a single event and begins to resemble a convergence. Multiple wars overlapping, some loud enough to remember, others quiet enough to be forgotten. The visible struggle earned independence. The invisible ones defined it. And if outcomes were shaped where no one was watching, then someone had to be capable of working there deliberately, patiently, and without leaving evidence behind. The next question rises naturally from that realization. Who were the forces able to operate so effectively within silence itself? Empires are often remembered as towering figures that rise, fall, and disappear. When wars are lost, the story suggests collapse, retreat, and humiliation. Flags are lowered, armies withdraw. Victors write history, and the defeated fade into the background. This image is comforting. It implies clean endings and clear consequences. But empires rarely vanish so neatly. They adapt. An empire is not just an army or a crown. It is a system trained to survive. When force becomes costly or visible, it changes shape. Influence that once marched openly learns to move quietly. Control that once relied on presence learns the value of proximity instead. Losing a war does not automatically mean losing leverage. Sometimes it means shedding weight. The northern frontier offered something unique. It was distant enough to avoid scrutiny, yet close enough to remain relevant. A space where influence could persist without spectacle. Power did not need to occupy territory openly there. It could linger through relationships, dependencies, expectations, and carefully maintained uncertainty. What looked like withdrawal was often redistribution. Military dominance is blunt. It attracts attention. Long-term influence prefers subtlety. In the north, the rules shifted. Authority became less about command and more about positioning. Alliances replaced orders. Economic pressure replaced occupation. Familiarity replaced obedience. The tools changed, but the intention remained the same. Continuity mattered more than victory. This is where the idea of defeat becomes unstable. Some outcomes that appeared like losses functioned as strategic exits. By stepping back visibly, empires reduced resistance while preserving relevance. Independence did not remove them from the room. It changed where they sat and how quietly they spoke. Proximity without visibility offered safety that open control never could. Distance from the spotlight allowed patience to return. Without the urgency of battle, influence could be exercised over decades rather than days. Small adjustments accumulated. Expectations formed slowly. Boundaries hardened without announcement. By the time effects became noticeable, their origins were already obscured. The Northern Theatre was ideal for this transformation. Its silence discouraged attention. Its instability allowed influence to pass unnoticed, disguised as necessity or adaptation. When conditions shifted, those who understood the environment adjusted first. Presence was no longer measured by uniforms or forts, but by access, timing, and familiarity with the land's rhythms. This reframing alters how independence itself is understood. Separation did occur, control was disrupted, but absence is not the same as irrelevance. An empire obsessed with continuity does not abandon spaces entirely. It learns where visibility helps and where it harms. It learns when to step forward and when to step aside. History often measures power by what can be seen. Battles won, borders redrawn, authority declared. Yet some of the most durable influence leaves no clear markers. It survives through adaptation, patience, and proximity. The Northern silence provided cover for this quieter survival. By the time peace was declared, certain positions were already secured. Not through conquest, but through understanding how systems endure change. Independence reshaped the surface of power, not its deeper currents. Those currents continued to flow, altered but intact, beneath new symbols and new stories. Once this is recognized, the idea of disappearance gives way to persistence. Empires did not simply leave when the war ended. They changed how they stayed. And staying without being noticed requires a different kind of presence, carried not by armies, but by people who could move between worlds, translate uncertainty, and operate where silence protected them. History tends to remember leaders because names are easy to hold on to. Faces can be carved in stone, titles can be repeated until they feel permanent. But the actual movement of power often depends on people whose usefulness came from remaining unremarkable. The ones who carried messages instead of speeches, the ones who negotiated rather than commanded, the ones who crossed boundaries quietly, without leaving records behind. These individuals did not think of themselves as shapers of history. Most were motivated by survival, opportunity, or quiet loyalty rather than ideology. Traders moved goods through uncertain routes. Negotiators translated not just language, but intention. Scouts mapped terrain that refused to stay consistent. Informants listened more than they spoke. Border figures lived between rules, adapting as authority shifted around them. They belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Unstable regions create space for such people. Where law is inconsistent and control incomplete, intermediaries become essential. They understand customs before treaties. They sense risk before orders arrive. They operate through trust, earned slowly, rather than power imposed suddenly. In the northern frontier, where authority fractured and reformed constantly, these figures mattered more than formal hierarchies ever could. Armies require structure. Empires require systems. Intermediaries require understanding. They knew which agreements were flexible and which were dangerous to break. They recognized which silences signaled threat and which offered opportunity. Their power did not come from command, but from access. They could speak to groups that would never meet openly. They could test reactions without commitment. They could adjust plans without explanation. Many of the most consequential decisions of the revolution passed through these hands, without being recorded as decisions at all. A delay here, a concession there, an introduction made quietly, an obligation left intentionally vague. These were not dramatic moments. They did not demand attention, but they accumulated. Over time, they shaped what options remained available and which quietly disappeared. This is where unease begins to settle. Not because these individuals were villains, but because they were effective. Their anonymity protected the system they served, even as it erased them personally. When history later searched for causes, it found documents and declarations, not the slow work of intermediaries, whose influence existed precisely because it could not be traced. Silence was their protection. Being forgotten was not failure, it was design. Systems remember structures, not messengers. Once the work was done, the people who carried it were no longer needed in memory. Their absence made outcomes feel inevitable rather than engineered. This selective memory shapes how power appears to move. It creates the illusion that decisions emerge naturally, without hands guiding them. The truth is quieter. Influence flowed through human connections that left no clean archive. The more effective the intermediary, the less visible the result appeared. For viewers drawn to hidden biographies, this realization changes the texture of history. It suggests that what we are taught to admire is often the final gesture, not the process. The loud moment, not the careful build-up. It encourages a different way of looking, one that notices who benefits from invisibility and who pays for it. These intermediaries were not meant to be remembered, because remembering them would reveal how adaptable power truly is. Names complicate narratives. Forgotten figures allow systems to appear abstract and unstoppable. Silence protects continuity, not individuals. The people who shaped outcomes disappeared back into the environment they navigated so well. With the players now visible, at least in outline, a deeper question emerges. If these intermediaries mattered so much, then how exactly did their quiet actions alter the direction of an entire revolution without ever revealing themselves? By the time the last shots faded and celebrations filled the streets, much of the future had already been settled. Victory arrived with cheers, relief, and carefully chosen words about freedom, but beneath that moment lay decisions that no parade could undo. Wars often feel decisive when they end, yet their outcomes are usually shaped long before the noise stops. The American Revolution was no exception. Battles mattered, but they did not decide everything. What mattered just as much were borders quietly acknowledged, routes quietly secured, and expectations quietly set. Control over movement proved more powerful than control over moments. Access to trade determined stability. Boundaries determined growth. These were not questions settled by muskets, but by patience and positioning, especially in places far removed from celebration and scrutiny. In the North, choices accumulated without announcement. Agreements took shape not as final statements, but as understandings. Some were written vaguely, others existed only in practice. All of them narrowed the range of what the new nation could realistically become. When independence was later declared, it entered a landscape already shaped by these constraints. Freedom arrived, but it arrived guided. This does not mean betrayal. It means sequence. The order of events matters. The most decisive choices were made when uncertainty still lingered and attention was elsewhere. Public focus followed the conflict it could see. Meanwhile, quieter negotiations defined what victory would allow. By the time the war ended publicly, the framework for peace had already hardened. Celebration has a way of disguising limits. The language of independence suggested openness and possibility. Yet behind that language stood arrangements that favored stability over experimentation. Certain expansions would prove easier than others. Certain alliances would feel natural. Certain conflicts would seem unavoidable. These were not accidents of history. They were the results of earlier positioning. The emotional weight of this realization lies in its subtlety. There was no single moment when the future closed. It narrowed gradually, through small decisions that felt temporary at the time. Each choice seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they shaped inevitability. Once absorbed into practice, these limits no longer felt imposed. They felt like reality. This is how quiet wars end, not with surrender, but with structure. By the time peace was announced, the most critical questions had already been answered privately. What remained was the performance of conclusion. The revolution closed one chapter, while another continued beneath it, unseen. Looking back, it becomes difficult to separate freedom from form. Independence was real, but it was not raw. It arrived conditioned by earlier compromises, guided by pathways already traced. The public never debated these terms because they never appeared as terms at all. They appeared as circumstances. That is the lasting power of decisions made in silence. They do not demand agreement, they simply shape what comes next. Once in place, they remove alternatives quietly, without resistance. Celebration continues, unaware that choice has already narrowed. This understanding reframes the end of the revolution, not as a beginning, but as a moment of confirmation. The visible war ended, the quiet one had already concluded its work. What followed would unfold within boundaries that felt natural, even inevitable, because their origins were hidden from view. With these decisions exposed, the story can no longer remain in the moment of victory. It must move forward, tracing how those northern choices echoed through expansion, identity, and conflict. The birth of the nation was only the first consequence. What followed would reveal just how deeply those early, unseen agreements had shaped everything that came after. Land is often treated as backdrop, a neutral stage upon which history acts. In the northern reaches, that assumption quietly fails. This territory was never prized for crowds or riches. Its value lived elsewhere, in what it controlled indirectly. Passage, delay, containment, space itself became pressure. It shaped movement without announcing boundaries, and influenced decisions without appearing to decide anything. Cold distances enforced patience, and patience determined who could act and who had to wait. That difference mattered more than ownership. Long before nations were named or celebrated at all. Forests were not obstacles here, but filters. Rivers did not simply connect places, they controlled timing. Frozen corridors opened briefly, then closed again, deciding who arrived early and who arrived too late. Undefined borders invited flexibility, allowing influence to stretch without claiming possession. In this environment, emptiness became useful because it could be adjusted without attracting attention. No crowds meant fewer witnesses. Fewer witnesses meant fewer questions. Fewer questions meant freedom to test limits. Maps flattened this complexity, turning leverage into blank space. That flattening hid intent, and intent survived inside geography, where memory rarely lingered long enough to act. The North was not valuable for what could be built quickly. It mattered for what could be slowed, redirected, or denied. Whoever influenced this land shaped how supplies moved, how news traveled, and how futures unfolded. Control did not require occupation. It required interference. By guiding flow instead of claiming ground, power avoided resistance while still determining outcomes. This was strategy refined by distance, learned through weather, silence, and waiting. In places where movement was fragile, denial became more effective than force. Preventing expansion quietly kept rivals cautious, uncertain, and dependent on permission. This influence felt natural, as though land itself was deciding. Yet every delay favored someone patient, someone already prepared, for the long future, still forming, quietly then. Modern imagination struggles with land that looks empty. We associate importance with activity and presence, but emptiness offers flexibility. It bends rather than breaks. It allows power to redraw influence without confronting opposition directly. Here, absence created room to adjust relationships quietly, without headlines or resistance. The North absorbed pressure that might have exploded elsewhere. By remaining undefined, it prevented certainty from forming too soon. This uncertainty discouraged bold moves while rewarding cautious planning. Expansion slowed, not because ambition faded, but because roots were carefully restricted. The land did not resist growth, it redirected it. That redirection shaped identity long before stories caught up. By then, patterns felt permanent, unquestioned, and deeply embedded, in future memory, of movement, westward dreams. The North was less about ownership than denial. Preventing rivals from expanding too freely preserved balance. Containment operated without declarations. Influence became subtraction rather than addition, deciding what would not happen rather than what would. This approach left few fingerprints, yet its effects accumulated steadily. Denied roots, forced adaptation. Adaptation reshaped settlement, trade, and expectation. People moved where movement was allowed, believing choice guided them. The constraints remained invisible, hidden inside geography. This invisibility made later outcomes feel inevitable. By the time resistance appeared, alternatives were already gone. That absence shaped ambition more than encouragement ever could, silently. Across generations, without announcement, or debate, or resistance. At first, mostly unnoticed. This understanding unsettles modern assumptions. America's future expansion was shaped long before it was named destiny. The land whispered limits quietly, until ambition learned to move within them. Cold, distance, and silence acted as unseen authors of possibility. Strategy merged with terrain so completely that intention vanished from sight. When westward movement later surged, it followed paths already prepared. What felt bold was often permitted. The earlier quiet made later motion seem natural. Few questioned why some directions opened and others did not. Geography had already answered, without conversation or resistance. This was leverage perfected, quiet enough to endure, and patient enough to shape generations, from a distance, still echoing. Power does not always arrive with banners or commands. In some places, it works best when it barely appears at all. The northern regions became a proving ground for this quieter approach. No permanent forts dominated the horizon. No marching columns declared intent. Instead, influence settled in gently, shaping conditions rather than issuing orders. What looked like disorder often served a purpose. Stability was allowed to exist, but never fully. Chaos was introduced carefully, just enough to keep any single authority from settling too comfortably into control. Economic pressure replaced occupation. Protection was offered selectively, withheld just as easily. Alliances shifted often enough to prevent trust from hardening into loyalty. This constant motion created a landscape where permanence felt risky. People adapted by staying flexible, changing partners, expectations, and priorities as circumstances shifted. In doing so, they aligned themselves with forces they never clearly identified. Survival required responsiveness, not allegiance. The absence of clear authority did not mean absence of influence. It meant influence diffused through daily decisions. When no power announces itself openly, people begin to treat conditions as natural. Shortages feel like weather. Opportunities feel like luck. Constraints feel unavoidable. Control dissolves into environment, and responsibility becomes difficult to assign. Outcomes appear organic, as though no one designed them. This approach thrives on patience. By allowing uncertainty to linger, outside interests avoided resistance. There was nothing concrete to oppose, no headquarters to confront, no flag to tear down. Influence worked through incentives, timing, and the careful cultivation of dependence. Help arrived when alignment occurred. Absence followed when it did not. Over time, patterns formed. People learned what behaviors brought safety and which invited risk, without ever being told directly. The North was not abandoned. It was left intentionally incomplete. Authority existed, but it shifted just enough to prevent consolidation. This looseness created the illusion of freedom. Choice appeared wide because rules remained unclear, yet the range of viable options narrowed quietly, shaped by access to resources, protection, and information. What remained possible felt self-directed. What vanished did so without explanation. This coexistence of freedom and manipulation unsettles comfortable assumptions. It reveals how influence can operate without domination, how guidance can occur without command. The environment did much of the work. Harsh conditions amplified dependency. Distance slowed response. Silence absorbed error. Together, they created space where subtle pressure achieved what force could not. People living inside this uncertainty rarely saw themselves as controlled. They made practical decisions, adjusted expectations, and moved when necessary. Each action felt personal. Yet taken together, these adjustments followed patterns that benefited interests capable of waiting. The longer the uncertainty endured, the more normalized it became. Choice narrowed without feeling imposed. This form of control avoids dramatic confrontation. It survives change because it adapts with it. When conditions shift, influence shifts alongside them, remaining just ahead of awareness. By the time patterns are recognized, they feel entrenched, part of the way things are. The quiet success of this approach lies in its invisibility. Understanding this reframes the Northern experience. What looked like neglect reveals intention. What felt like freedom coexisted with guidance. The land was managed loosely, not carelessly. Influence flowed through absence rather than presence, shaping outcomes while avoiding recognition. And within this controlled uncertainty lived ordinary people, adjusting day by day, unaware that their adaptations were quietly steering history in directions already prepared for them. This realization prepares the ground for what comes next. Influence did not remain abstract or distant. It touched lives directly, shaping routines, fears, and expectations. To understand the full weight of this invisible control, the story must now turn toward those who lived inside it, navigating uncertainty without knowing its source, carrying consequences that would outlast the silence that surrounded them. Their experiences reveal how management without occupation leaves marks that memory struggles to name, but never truly erases from the land. While strategies unfolded quietly across maps and negotiations, life in the northern regions continued without clarity or pause. Communities did not experience the Quiet War as an abstract contest of influence. They experienced it as uncertainty woven into daily survival. Settlers, traders, and displaced families lived inside conditions that shifted without warning. Authority felt temporary. Protection felt conditional. Promises arrived softly and disappeared just as easily. No one announced when the rules changed. They simply did. Loyalty in these places could not remain fixed, because stability itself refused to settle. People adapted not out of betrayal, but out of necessity. Alignments shifted, because remaining still was often more dangerous than changing course. One season favored cooperation with one power. The next season demanded distance from it. What looked like inconsistency from the outside felt like survival on the inside. Choice narrowed into response. Decisions were made quickly, without certainty, guided by weather, supply, and rumor rather than ideology. These communities did not choose the Quiet War. They inherited it. They woke up inside it, lived alongside it, and aged within its unresolved tension. Futures felt provisional. Children grew up sensing that permanence was fragile. Homes were built lightly, plans remained flexible. Trust was offered cautiously and withdrawn without drama. Life learned to exist without expectation of continuity. While nations debated independence and empires negotiated outcomes elsewhere, ordinary lives absorbed the consequences. The North became a liminal space, suspended between definitions. It was neither fully colonial nor fully independent. Authority existed, but it lacked permanence. Freedom existed, but it lacked assurance. The space between identities stretched thin, and people lived inside that stretch, carrying its weight quietly. Protection could vanish overnight. A promised alliance could dissolve with no explanation. Supplies might arrive one year and fail the next. Survival depended less on belief than on awareness. Those who noticed shifts early endured longer. Those who trusted stability too deeply paid the cost. The land taught attentiveness. Silence taught restraint. History rarely lingers on these lives, because they resist simple telling. Their stories lack neat conclusions. They do not fit comfortably inside victory or defeat. Yet they absorb the pressure that allowed larger systems to appear decisive elsewhere. Quiet zones do this. They hold uncertainty so that certainty can exist somewhere else. They buffer instability so that centers feel secure. Empathy emerges here without sentimentality. These communities were not heroes or villains. They were participants without consent, adjusting to realities shaped far beyond their reach. Their suffering was not dramatic enough to attract attention, yet constant enough to shape generations. The cost of invisibility was endurance without recognition. What remained was resilience born from necessity, not celebration. Lives unfolded cautiously, oriented toward adaptation rather than ambition. This subtle conditioning left traces. People learned to expect uncertainty. They learned to read absence as signal. These habits did not disappear when the war ended publicly. They carried forward, shaping expectations long after the quiet conflict faded from memory. This emotional weight marks the true cost of invisible power. It reveals how systems protect themselves by allowing consequences to settle where they are least visible. The North absorbed these costs silently. It became a place defined by waiting, adjusting, and enduring. That endurance mattered. It shaped perspectives, priorities, and relationships that would later influence how the new nation organized itself. Once these human consequences are acknowledged, the story cannot remain at the level of strategy. The lived uncertainty of these communities fed directly into the structure of what followed. Their adaptation became precedent. Their resilience became assumption. What was learned in quiet carried forward into law, policy, and expectation. With the human cost now visible, the narrative is ready to move outward again. The patterns formed here did not remain isolated. They traveled quietly into the emerging nation's framework, shaping how authority was applied, how expansion unfolded, and how uncertainty was managed. The next step is to trace how this northern experience, absorbed without acknowledgement, became part of the foundation upon which a new country was built. Victory arrived with noise and relief. Bells rang, crowds gathered, and language swelled with promise. Independence sounded like a door thrown open, a clean beginning, a future unbound by anything that came before. In that moment, limits were easy to ignore. Celebration has a way of eclipsing boundaries, especially the ones no one can see. The end of fighting felt like the end of constraint itself. Yet beneath the joy lay outlines already drawn, faint lines shaping where movement would later slow, where ambition would later turn. These lines were not announced. They did not need to be. They had been forming quietly while attention was elsewhere, waiting for the moment when freedom would claim the stage. They hardened unnoticed as cheers rose and memory fixed itself on victory alone. Independence did not arrive empty. It arrived carrying the past inside it, folded so neatly it felt invisible. Agreements made in uncertainty had already narrowed options. Routes chosen earlier became habits. Borders acknowledged quietly became expectations. Expansion would later feel bold, yet it followed corridors already accepted. Diplomacy would seem flexible, yet it moved within assumptions shaped years earlier. Internal unity would be praised, while tension lingered beneath it, managed rather than resolved. None of this erased freedom. It framed it. The nation stepped forward, not into open space, but into terrain already shaped by compromise. Those limits felt natural because they were inherited, not imposed, absorbed gradually through practice instead of debate. They became the ground beneath every confident step taken in the years ahead by a celebrating public. The language of liberation suggested endless possibility, but possibility always bends toward structure. Northern decisions, made before peace was declared, dictated how far freedom could stretch without breaking. Access mattered more than conquest. Stability mattered more than experimentation. These priorities did not shout, they settled. They became policy without appearing political. When conflicts later arose, solutions felt predetermined, shaped by earlier limits that no one remembered choosing. Freedom did not erase influence, it absorbed it, converting old leverage into new norms. What once required management became accepted reality, quiet and unquestioned. Nation building became an act of navigation, reading conditions carefully rather than inventing them, and measuring ambition against inherited constraints that surfaced slowly during expansion, diplomacy, and internal cohesion across the emerging republic, without dramatic announcement or celebration afterward. This framing avoids accusation. There was no secret hand guiding everything toward harm. There was momentum, inheritance, and preference for survival. Young nations choose continuity where uncertainty threatens fracture. Earlier agreements felt safer than reopening fragile questions. Over time, safety hardened into boundary. Boundary became identity. The invisible lines shaped expectations, teaching citizens how to imagine possibility. Freedom remained genuine, but it was practiced within contours learned long before anyone spoke them aloud. These contours guided ambition, moderated conflict, and narrowed futures without appearing to command. They were inherited realities, absorbed through routine, reinforced by success, and rarely questioned. Because they worked, they endured quietly shaping choices after the fighting ended, and celebrations faded into history, leaving structure behind to guide a new nation toward cautious stability rather than uncertainty. Understanding independence this way changes the story without diminishing it. Liberation still mattered, sacrifice still counted, but freedom functioned less as escape than as navigation through inherited terrain. The past did not disappear, it traveled forward, embedded in borders, habits, and assumptions. Seeing this does not weaken the founding, it deepens it. Nation building becomes a careful reading of limits, a negotiation with what already exists. From this vantage, identity forms not by erasing influence, but by steering within it, learning where movement is possible and where patience is required. The celebration marks a beginning, yet the path ahead follows lines drawn quietly earlier, during uncertainty, silence, and northern negotiation that shaped unity and expansion for generations that followed without ever naming their source inside national memory or maps openly. Nations are born into uncertainty, yet they cannot live inside it for long. To survive, they must explain themselves, especially to those who arrive after the danger has passed. Complex origins threaten cohesion. Contradiction invites doubt. So stories are shaped, not to deceive, but to stabilize. Over time, explanation becomes tradition, and tradition hardens into memory. The American founding required clarity. A new population needed a shared beginning that felt purposeful and earned. The quieter realities of the Northern War did not serve that need. Compromise, ambiguity, and unseen negotiation do not inspire loyalty. They raise questions, so they drifted from the story, not hidden away, but gently replaced by something simpler. Heroes stood in for systems, battles stood in for negotiations, noise stood in for silence. This forgetting was not accidental, it was functional. Myths did not erase truth, they redirected attention. They focused memory on moments that unified, rather than moments that unsettled. The result was not falsehood, but emphasis. Nations remember what allows them to move forward without fracturing. What complicates unity quietly fades, even if it once mattered deeply. The Northern conflict carried too much ambiguity to anchor identity. It involved blurred authority, shifting alliances, and outcomes that resisted moral clarity. Such material destabilizes young nations. It asks citizens to accept uncertainty as part of their origin. That is a difficult inheritance. Simpler stories provide steadier ground. They give people a place to stand. Silence, then, becomes an ingredient rather than an absence. What is not said holds the structure together. Children learn clean narratives before complex ones. Ceremonies repeat selected moments until they feel complete. Over generations, repetition replaces recollection. Memory narrows without resistance. No one feels the loss because stability takes its place. This process reshapes how power appears. Influence that operated quietly remains effective precisely because it does not challenge the story being told. Forgotten forces continue working beneath the narrative, unaffected by celebration or denial. The myth does not stop them. It simply looks elsewhere. Understanding this changes how forgetting itself is judged. Silence is not always imposed by force. Often, it is chosen collectively, reinforced by comfort and necessity. People rarely demand complication when simplicity works. They accept stories that help them belong. Identity forms around what is repeated, not what is complete. The result is a nation confident in its beginnings, yet unaware of certain foundations. The quiet war did not vanish. It receded into structure. Its compromises became assumptions. Its limits became norms. Its presence remained, even as memory thinned. This is the deeper psychological turn. Nations do not remember everything they survive. They remember what stabilizes them afterward. The rest becomes background, shaping behavior without entering awareness. Silence protects identity by keeping attention focused forward. Once this selective memory is recognized, the story cannot end with myth alone. Forgotten forces do not disappear because they are unnecessary to remember. They continue operating regardless, shaping outcomes long after celebration fades. The final question is not why these stories were forgotten, but what happens when their influence never stopped. It also changes how we listen to history itself. Instead of asking only what was said, attention turns to patterns that persist without explanation. Structures endure even when names fade. The quiet Northern War continues not as a memory, but as habit. Certain conflicts feel familiar because their foundations remain unexamined. Identity rests on these inherited silences, even when people cannot name them. Recognizing this does not demand rejection of the past, only awareness of its shape. Stories become more honest when absence is allowed to speak. What was once unnecessary to remember becomes necessary to notice. The influence never announced itself, yet it still guides direction. That guidance lingers, quietly, shaping choices that feel personal, free, and inevitable. Awareness slows the rush to certainty and opens space for reflection, without accusation, without blame, without urgency, allowing history to feel present. Wars are usually remembered by their endings. Dates are recorded, treaties are signed, guns fall silent. A sense of closure settles into the story, reassuring later generations that conflict belongs safely in the past. But some wars do not end that way. They change shape. They move from noise into structure, from violence into assumption. The Quiet Northern War followed this path. It did not conclude. It transformed. Once independence was secured, attention shifted forward. The language of beginnings replaced the language of struggle. Yet the logic that governed the northern frontier never disappeared. It adapted to a new environment. Borders remained sensitive. Expansion carried hesitation alongside ambition. Influence continued operating without visibility, now embedded in rules, habits, and inherited expectations rather than direct negotiation. What once required patience and secrecy became routine. The patterns persisted quietly. Anxiety gathered around edges rather than centers. Movement was encouraged in some directions and slowed in others. Authority remained cautious, shaped by an inherited fear of instability. Control continued to prefer guidance over confrontation. These tendencies did not announce their origins. They felt natural, as though they had always existed. That is how quiet wars survive. They become part of how decisions are made, rather than something remembered. Institutions absorbed this logic first. Policies reflected assumptions formed long ago. Certain choices appeared reasonable without debate. Certain limits felt necessary without explanation. Over time, these patterns hardened into expectation. People learned how the system responded and adjusted themselves accordingly. No force was required. The structure did the work. The northern conflict no longer needed to be fought openly. Its principles lived on inside practice. Influence without visibility became normalized. Negotiation behind the scenes felt appropriate. Delay became strategy. Silence became stability. What began as adaptation turned into habit, and habit shaped generations who never experienced the original conflict yet lived within its outcomes. This creates a strange relationship with time. The past feels finished because its language is no longer used, yet its influence remains active. The war appears over because it is no longer named. But naming is not the same as ending. Endings are narrative conveniences. They help stories feel complete. History rarely offers such clarity. The Quiet War extended forward by becoming unremarkable. Its presence was felt not through crisis, but through continuity. Each generation inherited assumptions shaped by earlier compromises. These assumptions guided action without requiring explanation. When tensions surfaced, responses followed familiar paths, reinforcing patterns rather than questioning them. The source remained hidden, not intentionally, but because it no longer felt relevant to remember. This absence of memory does not weaken the influence. It strengthens it. Forces that do not need to justify themselves operate with greater ease. The northern logic continued to shape how authority was applied, how uncertainty was managed, and how freedom was framed. People experienced consequences without context, reacting to symptoms rather than origins. Understanding this shifts the sense of finality. The revolution ended. The Quiet War did not. It continued inside the nation it helped shape, embedded in expectations that felt inherited rather than chosen. This does not mean everything that followed was controlled or predetermined. It means that choices were made within a framework whose origins had already faded from view. The story remains unfinished because its influence never stopped. It simply became difficult to see. That difficulty created comfort. Comfort allowed continuity. Continuity disguised origin. The cycle repeated quietly, without urgency, without spectacle. This realization does not demand alarm. It invites reflection. If some wars continue without being remembered, then history is not a series of closed chapters, but a living structure. What matters is not only what ended, but what endured. With this understanding, the narrative moves forward naturally. If the quiet war survived inside institutions and assumptions, then its consequences must surface across generations, shaping conflicts that feel new but are deeply familiar. The next chapter begins where echoes become visible, tracing how decisions made patiently and unseen continue to shape lives long after their authors are gone, carrying influence forward without ever calling attention to themselves. After independence, the horizon appeared wide and inviting, stretching outward with promise. Open land seemed endless, opportunity felt immediate, and movement carried the language of choice. Maps filled with blank spaces invited imagination, and the future looked like a simple continuation of motion. Expansion felt natural, even inevitable, as if freedom itself were pushing people forward. Yet this image hides something quieter. Motion did not mean openness, and movement did not mean permission. What followed independence was not a breakthrough into limitless space, but a careful release along routes already shaped. The horizon looked open because the walls were invisible. Long before westward ambition hardened into identity, limits had been quietly accepted. Decisions made during uncertainty had already marked where growth could flow and where it would slow. Certain corridors opened easily, while others resisted movement without explanation. Expansion worked less like discovery and more like pressure relief, allowing energy to escape where resistance was lowest. Paths that aligned with inherited agreements felt obvious. Paths that challenged them felt impractical, even reckless. Over time, these preferences disguised themselves as choice. People moved not toward every possibility, but toward the possibilities that remained accessible. This guidance did not feel restrictive. It felt natural. Freedom was structured to resemble abundance while functioning through invisible corridors. The nation expanded, but not randomly. It followed channels shaped by earlier restraint, by negotiations no longer remembered, by compromises absorbed without debate. Ambition alone did not decide direction. Terrain, access, and expectation worked together, steering movement gently but firmly. The result was growth that appeared bold on the surface, while remaining cautious underneath. There is a quiet grief hidden inside this realization. Expansion was not betrayal or deception, it was adaptation. The nation moved not where it dreamed, but where it was permitted to move without reopening fragile tensions. Every step forward balanced hope against inherited limits. What could not be pursued faded quietly, rarely named as loss. The open horizon was less an invitation than a narrowing funnel, widening briefly before guiding movement along predetermined lines. This understanding changes how progress is measured. Movement did occur, settlement did spread, and borders did shift. Yet each change followed logic shaped earlier than memory admits. Expansion relieved pressure, without resolving its source. It allowed continuity rather than rupture. By the time ambition gathered speed, options had already narrowed. What remained felt like destiny, because alternatives had vanished unnoticed. The psychology of the open horizon relied on contrast. People were told they were free, while being guided gently towards specific outcomes. Because guidance was subtle, it felt self-directed. Because restrictions were unseen, they felt non-existent. This balance preserved belief without inviting resistance. Freedom remained real, but its range was quietly defined. The nation learned to expand carefully, even while celebrating boundlessness. This illusion served stability. By releasing pressure along acceptable paths, the nation avoided confronting deeper constraints. Growth became management. Expansion became a way to maintain balance rather than disrupt it. Each mile traveled reinforced earlier decisions, confirming their wisdom simply because movement continued. The future unfolded within channels so familiar they disappeared from awareness. Understanding this does not diminish courage or sacrifice. It reframes what followed. The open horizon was not a lie, but a lens shaped by earlier limits. Movement felt voluntary because alternatives were no longer visible. Expansion followed permission, not pure desire. And if the nation moved carefully, it did so because careful movement was all that remained available. With these unseen boundaries acknowledged, another question inevitably surfaces. If expansion followed inherited limits, someone must have absorbed the cost, and someone must have lived with the consequences first. That cost did not vanish into theory. It settled into lives, landscapes, and expectations, waiting quietly for recognition, shaping futures before they were named, carried forward by people who did not choose the direction, only the necessity of moving. Their steps echoed after permission was granted. As expansion gained momentum, something subtle but consequential occurred. Movement began to treat presence as resistance, not through hatred or open hostility, but through categorization. People already living within northern and frontier spaces were no longer seen as participants in the future being built. They became variables, complications, elements to be adjusted so motion could continue smoothly. This shift did not arise from cruelty alone. It grew out of systems designed to preserve balance at almost any cost. Large systems struggle with complexity. They simplify in order to move. Lives become numbers. Communities become locations. Relationships become obstacles or advantages, depending on how easily they align with inherited plans. Consultation takes time, and time threatens momentum. So decisions are made elsewhere, justified later, through necessity. Stability demands efficiency, and efficiency rarely listens carefully. Those living in these regions felt the change before it was named. Agreements arrived without explanation and dissolved without apology. Protection was promised and then redirected. Futures narrowed quietly. The language surrounding these shifts was careful, often neutral, framed around order, safety, or progress. Rarely did it acknowledge the lived reality of those affected. Complexity was reduced not because it lacked importance, but because it resisted management. Treaties were drafted to settle uncertainty, yet they often introduced new fragility. Relocations were framed as solutions, yet they displaced trust as much as people. Disappearances were rarely acknowledged as outcomes, only as absences. Each action made sense inside the system that required forward motion. Taken together, they reveal a pattern. Stability mattered more than consent. Movement mattered more than understanding. This realization carries weight because it does not rely on spectacle. There is no single dramatic injustice to point to, no moment where cruelty announces itself loudly. Instead, discomfort accumulates slowly. The audience senses the cost through implication. Lives adjusted repeatedly to decisions made beyond their sight. Survival required adaptation, not participation. The future approached them rather than including them. The Quiet War set this precedent early. When influence operates invisibly, consequences often land where visibility is weakest. Communities in liminal spaces absorb change so centers could feel secure. Their endurance became part of the system's functioning. What they lost was rarely recorded as loss. It appeared as progress elsewhere. This reframing avoids simple blame. It recognizes momentum as a force capable of overriding empathy without malice. When systems prioritize continuity, they interpret resistance as obstruction. Human presence becomes interference when it challenges pre-existing roots. Over time, this logic feels reasonable. It embeds itself in policy, language, and expectation. The emotional weight of this understanding lies in its restraint. These communities were not erased through a single decision, but through repetition. Each adjustment felt temporary. Each compromise felt necessary. Over generations, necessity hardened into assumption. People were managed rather than heard, not because they lacked value, but because listening risked slowing movement. This pattern reshaped the nation as much as it reshaped the land. It taught institutions how to act under pressure. It normalized distance between decision and consequence. It reinforced the idea that stability justifies silence. Once learned, this logic traveled forward, shaping responses to future challenges long after the frontier faded from view. Recognizing this cost does not end the story in judgment. It deepens it. It shows how a nation learned to prioritize motion over inclusion, order over conversation. The Quiet War did not only define borders and routes, it shaped character, and with that character formed, the narrative must turn inward, examining how these choices changed not just who the nation acted upon, but how it came to see itself, justify itself, and live with the outcomes it produced while continuing to move forward. A nation rarely survives on action alone, it survives on explanation. As expansion continued, movement outpaced understanding, and understanding required language that could keep pace. Choices were reframed as necessities. Consequences softened into inevitabilities. Destiny replaced accountability. offering comfort where clarity threatened cohesion. This was not deception aimed outward. It was reassurance turned inward, a way to move forward without fracturing the image held in common. The Northern experience taught an early lesson. Ambiguity could be managed through story. Silence could be wrapped in purpose. Decisions made quietly did not remain silent. They were translated into narratives that felt stabilizing rather than unsettling. Language became a bridge between what happened and what needed to be believed. Over time, that bridge felt so natural it disappeared beneath the feet of those crossing it. As routes narrowed and people adjusted, explanations followed closely behind. Expansion was described as progress. Delay was framed as patience. Loss became sacrifice. Each phrase protected identity by absorbing compromise into meaning. The nation did not lie to others first. It learned to speak to itself in ways that reduced dissonance. Repetition did the rest. What was repeated enough lost its edge and became common sense. Justification worked because it answered fear more than fact. A young nation needed coherence. Contradiction threatened unity, and unity felt essential for survival. So stories evolved to support continuity. They preserved pride while accommodating reality. The Quiet War in the North had shown how effective this could be. Influence operated best when its logic felt moral, even benevolent. Over time, this approach moved from instinct to institution. Policies echoed narratives. Education reinforced them. Ceremony repeated them. Each layer reduced the need to question origins. What began as explanation became assumption. Assumption became identity. The distance between cause and effect widened enough that responsibility blurred. Outcomes seemed natural, even necessary, because the stories supporting them had been present for generations. This process did not erase doubt. It organized it. Doubt was allowed to exist so long as it did not interrupt momentum. Questions softened into background noise. Concern turned into resignation. Language provided a way to live alongside unease without addressing it directly. This made stability possible, but at a cost rarely named. The most enduring justifications were not imposed. They were learned. People absorbed them through repetition until they felt like personal insight rather than inherited explanation. The nation grew accustomed to its own reasoning, trusting familiar narratives because they had always been there. Over time, the effort required to reconsider them felt unnecessary, even dangerous. The Quiet War's greatest lesson was not strategy, but storytelling. It demonstrated that control did not require complete agreement, only shared acceptance. Once acceptance settled, transparency became optional. Clarity threatened balance. Ambiguity preserved it. These habits outlasted the frontier and followed the nation into new challenges. Near the end of this pattern, a pause emerges. Not a conclusion, but a moment of awareness. How many explanations survive simply because they work? How many compromises feel invisible because language has made them feel inevitable? Justification does not remove doubt. It teaches societies how to live with it. And in doing so, it prepares the ground for what must be forgotten to keep moving forward. What is rarely acknowledged is how comforting this process becomes. Once justification settles, resistance feels unnecessary. The story provides warmth, familiarity, and a sense of direction. People repeat explanations because they offer relief, not because they have been proven. Over time, alternatives stop appearing realistic. Questioning begins to feel disruptive rather than curious. This is how justification survives intact across generations. It travels quietly inside habit, education, and assumption. Each retelling smooths rough edges. Each omission feels merciful. The nation learns to move forward, carrying doubt without examining it, trusting the story to hold what cannot be resolved. In this way, justification becomes inherited alongside borders and institutions. It stabilizes motion while concealing cost. And as long as it functions, it resists replacement, quietly preparing the ground for the silences that must follow. Those silences do not end discussion. They postpone it, pushing unresolved questions forward in time, where they wait patiently, untouched, until circumstances force them back into view again later quietly. History feels solid because it shows what endured. Dates, borders, institutions, outcomes. Yet beneath that surface lies a quieter reality. For every path that became permanent, others appeared briefly and then vanished. Not through catastrophe or defeat, but through neglect, hesitation, and decision made elsewhere. What survives feels inevitable only because what disappeared left so little trace. In the northern regions, possibilities once multiplied. Different alliances were tested lightly, never announced. Border arrangements shifted on paper, then dissolved before hardening. Models of coexistence flickered into view, examined, adjusted, and quietly set aside. These were not failures that demanded explanation. They were options that introduced uncertainty at moments when stability mattered more, so they faded, leaving no dramatic record behind them. Nations cannot pursue every future. Choice requires exclusion, but exclusion does not always look like rejection. Sometimes it looks like delay until interest cools. Sometimes it looks like silence until momentum shifts. Alternatives expire when attention moves on. The North became a place where this process could occur without scrutiny. Its distance absorbed indecision. Its complexity discouraged commitment. Possibilities could be explored without obligation, then abandoned without consequence. This creates a subtle distortion in memory. Later generations see only what remained and assume it always stood alone. The roads not taken feel imaginary because they were never named loudly enough to remember. Yet they were real. They shaped debate briefly, influenced decisions temporarily, and then receded. Their disappearance was not an accident. It was a preference for balance over experiment. The emotional weight here is gentle, not accusatory. There is no suggestion that the wrong choices were made. Only that choice itself narrows reality. Some futures threaten cohesion simply by existing. They ask questions too early, introduce flexibility where firmness feels safer. In fragile moments, nations choose paths that reduce uncertainty, even if other options offer richness or equity. Those options fade because remembering them would reopen questions that were intentionally closed. The North served as a quiet archive of these abandoned directions. Its silence protected the nation from having to explain why certain possibilities ended. Over time, forgetting performed a kind of mercy. Without memory of alternatives, the remaining path felt natural, even destined. What had once been contingent slowly hardened into certainty. This is how inevitability is constructed, not through force, but through absence. When memory thins, outcomes feel preordained. The future appears to flow cleanly from the past, uninterrupted by forks that once existed. Yet beneath that clean line lie faint impressions, traces of other routes that might have led elsewhere. Counterfactual thinking often feels speculative, indulgent, but here it serves a quieter purpose. It reminds us that history is shaped as much by what was released as by what was retained. The future you know exists because others were quietly discarded, not because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient. Understanding this does not invite regret, it invites humility. It reveals how much of reality depends on timing, patience, and tolerance for uncertainty. Alternatives disappear not because they lack merit, but because they arrive at the wrong moment. Nations remember what stabilizes them. They forget what complicates them. Once this pattern is seen, forgetting itself becomes visible. It is no longer a passive loss, but an active process reinforced by repetition and relief. The question that follows is no longer which paths were abandoned, but how forgetting became so practiced, so natural, that absence itself began to feel like proof. If futures can vanish so quietly, then memory must be doing important work, deciding not only what is recalled, but what is allowed to feel inevitable. This added reflection lingers on consequence, suggesting that what fades from record continues to shape direction. Forgotten options do not disappear completely. They compress into assumptions. In time, those assumptions guide choice invisibly, shaping action without memory, completing the quiet cycle that turns loss into certainty for generations ahead. Silence is often mistaken for absence, as though nothing exists where nothing is said. But in fragile moments, silence can be deliberate, shaped carefully to hold things together. Young nations are especially vulnerable to questions. Too many unanswered ones can loosen trust, fracture identity, and reopen conflicts that survival depends on leaving behind. In such conditions, uncertainty becomes dangerous. To endure, it must be limited. Silence offers that limit. It stabilizes by narrowing attention. What remains unspoken does not vanish. It is simply set aside so movement can continue. This is not always an act of concealment. Often, it is an act of care. The choice to leave certain stories untouched allows a collective to breathe, to build routines, to imagine continuity without being pulled backward by unresolved tension. Forgetting, then, becomes active rather than passive. It is reinforced through repetition of selected narratives, through education that emphasizes coherence over contradiction, through ceremony that honors clarity instead of complexity. Over time, these choices form a habit. Memory shapes itself around what is useful. The quiet Northern War did not disappear because it lacked importance. It disappeared because it complicated identity at a moment when unity felt essential. Silence protected structure. It gave people something solid to stand on. The alternative would have been constant negotiation with the past, a process that threatens momentum. By limiting what was remembered, the nation limited what needed to be explained. This was not cruelty, it was triage. Some truths are postponed so that life can continue. The unsettling realization is that this kind of forgetting serves two purposes at once. It preserves stability while also preserving power. Care and control share space here. Silence comforts by smoothing rough edges, but it also narrows perspective. The same absence that prevents fracture can prevent awareness. Both outcomes unfold together, inseparable. People rarely experience this process as manipulation. They experience relief, questions quiet, stories align, identity feels simpler. What is repeated becomes familiar, and familiarity becomes trust. The cost of this trust is complexity. What cannot be neatly explained fades from conversation. Over time, silence stops feeling chosen. It feels natural. The Northern conflict lived inside this quiet. Its ambiguity did not fit the need for cohesion, so it settled beneath awareness. Yet, it did not dissolve. It remained active inside structure, shaping assumptions and limits without entering language. Silence did not erase influence. It concealed its origin. This duality replaces accusation with understanding. Forgetting can be protective. It can also be limiting. Both can be true simultaneously. Survival often demands compromise between clarity and continuity. Nations choose what to carry forward, not because they are dishonest, but because they are fragile. The danger lies not in silence itself, but in believing silence ends what it hides. Suppressed truths rarely disappear entirely. They resurface indirectly, through tension, repetition, and unresolved patterns. What is set aside continues to exert pressure, even when unnamed. Recognizing silence as intentional changes the question. It is no longer about why certain stories were forgotten, but what forgetting made possible, and what it postponed. The quiet Northern War was delayed, not dismissed. Its influence continued without acknowledgement, shaping decisions while remaining unexamined. Once this is understood, silence loses its innocence without becoming villainous. It becomes a tool, effective and costly. And tools leave marks. The final question waits beneath the calm. If silence helped the nation survive, what happens when what was suppressed refuses to stay quiet forever? Foundations rarely announce themselves. They sit beneath movement, absorbing weight long after builders have gone. When compromises are left unspoken, they do not dissolve, they compress. Pressure settles into them slowly, shaping what can stand above and what eventually cracks. The quiet war left foundations like this behind, heavy with agreements never fully named and limits never openly discussed. These buried structures continued working. Political arguments returned to familiar fault lines. Regional distrust surfaced where unity was assumed. Cultural fractures reopened with new language but old shape. None of this appeared accidental. It felt repetitive, as though the nation was circling questions it had already touched but never resolved. The present kept stumbling over the same invisible thresholds, unsure why they existed at all. Unresolved compromise behaves differently from resolved conflict. Conflict declares itself and invites conclusion. Compromise lingers. It asks to be remembered while encouraging silence. Each generation inherits the tension without the context. They feel disagreement without knowing its origin. Debates gain intensity because they are about more than the moment. They carry accumulated weight. The Northern decisions lingered this way. They shaped expectations about authority, trust, and control. They influenced where skepticism gathered and where loyalty thinned. Over time, patterns formed. Certain regions felt perpetually unsettled. Certain arguments returned with familiar urgency. Each recurrence suggested novelty, yet their structure remained unchanged. The past waited patiently, resurfacing when conditions allowed. This continuity unsettles because it challenges the idea of progress as clean replacement. New language does not automatically create new foundations. When underlying structures remain, disputes repeat under different names. The audience is invited to feel recognition rather than alarm. Familiar struggles feel familiar because they are echoes. They repeat because the ground beneath them has not shifted. Silence played a role in this persistence. What was never named could not be resolved. What could not be resolved could not be released. The nation carried forward compromises disguised as assumptions, unsure where they originated. Over time, these assumptions hardened into identity. Questioning them felt destabilizing, even when tension grew. Pressure does not always explode. Sometimes it migrates. It shifts location, tone, and language, searching for expression. The Quiet War's influence moved this way, threading itself through generations without demanding attention. It revealed itself indirectly, through contradiction and repetition, rather than through memory. This is the weight of unspoken foundations. They do not collapse suddenly. They shape gradually. Lives unfold within their limits. Conflicts flare along their seams. People sense imbalance without seeing cause. The discomfort feels personal, yet its roots are structural. Understanding this does not offer resolution. It offers orientation. It explains why certain arguments refuse to fade, and why reassurance often feels temporary. The past does not stay silent. It waits. It waits inside language, policy, habit, and fear, pressing upward until acknowledged. As the pace slows, reflection replaces urgency. The story pauses, not to conclude, but to prepare. What has been buried will surface differently in the chapters ahead, no longer as quiet influence, but as visible strain. The reckoning does not arrive suddenly. It builds patiently, shaped by foundations laid long ago, waiting for moments when silence can no longer hold. This awareness settles slowly, inviting patience rather than reaction. The audience is not asked to judge the past, only to notice how deeply it continues to act. Every inherited system carries hidden stresses, and those stresses surface when attention drifts away. The Quiet War remains present, not as memory, but as pressure-shaping response. Each generation inherits responsibility without inheritance of explanation. That imbalance creates friction, revisited again and again, until recognition replaces denial. The coming chapters do not promise closure, they promise visibility. What has waited beneath language and ceremony begins to press outward, seeking form. The past leans forward, not demanding punishment, only acknowledgement. When silence finally thins, it does so gradually, revealing continuity rather than rupture. History does not shout, it reminds. The reminder is subtle, insistent, and difficult to ignore once perceived. These patterns prepare the ground for moments when buried tensions surface openly, transforming quiet inheritance into visible consequence, and reminding us that unresolved beginnings shape every ending we believe has already passed within collective memory and identity. History often announces change with drama, but experience rarely feels that way at first. Moments later, labeled as turning points, once arrived quietly, wrapped in uncertainty. Conflicts seemed to appear overnight. Political shifts felt abrupt. Regional fractures looked sudden, as if caused by a single spark. At the time, they were framed as surprises, unavoidable reactions to immediate pressure. Yet surprise is often the product of forgetting. Long before visible rupture, pressure accumulates out of sight, settling into habits, language, and expectation. Silence delays confrontation. It stretches tension across years, even decades, until release feels instantaneous. What shocks observers is not speed, but proximity to the surface. The Quiet Northern War taught this pattern early. Questions about borders, authority, autonomy, and trust were never fully answered. They were postponed. Compromises settled without resolution, forming unstable layers beneath progress. As generations passed, Those layers hardened into structure. When conditions shifted, stress followed familiar lines. Events that felt unprecedented traced paths already worn thin by repetition. What appeared chaotic followed memory. The past did not vanish. It receded, waiting for circumstances that allowed its return without announcement or permission. Looking back, historians often isolate moments, attaching meaning to dates rather than processes. This habit reinforces the illusion of suddenness. It suggests that conflict erupts spontaneously, rather than emerging from endurance. In reality, silence functions like compression. It concentrates unresolved questions until they demand expression. The Northern Compromises created pressure points that reappeared whenever expansion accelerated, authority tightened, or uncertainty increased. Each return felt new because language changed, but structure stayed familiar. Recognition lags behind recurrence. Across decades, this repetition produced a strange rhythm. Calm followed tension. Tension returned as debate. Debate hardened into confrontation. Each cycle felt distinct to those living through it, yet the themes rarely shifted. Control versus autonomy, security versus openness, trust versus suspicion. These were not inventions of later eras, they were inheritances. The Quiet War embedded them deeply, ensuring they would surface whenever balance tipped. What we call crises were often reminders, signals that something unfinished had reached another limit. This reframing does not deny agency or responsibility, it changes timing. Instead of asking why things happened, it asks when pressure became unavoidable. Delayed eruption explains why societies feel caught off guard by patterns they have rehearsed for generations. Memory fades at the surface, while structure persists beneath. When language fails, tension speaks. What appears to arrive suddenly is often the moment silence can no longer contain what it has held. The unease this creates is subtle. It replaces shock with recognition. Viewers begin noticing continuity where they once saw randomness. The past stops feeling distant and starts feeling patient. History no longer appears as a sequence of breaks, but as a series of pauses between resurfacing questions. The Quiet War becomes less an event and more a pattern, recurring whenever conditions invite it back into view. Once this idea settles, inevitability loses its authority. What seemed spontaneous begins to look prepared. Conflict feels less like chaos and more like consequence. The narrative does not search for a single moment of failure, because repetition has no single origin. It gathers strength through postponement. Understanding this prepares the next step. If pressure released unevenly, it must have shown itself most clearly somewhere specific. The story now turns toward the places where inherited tension surfaced first, revealing fault lines that had been waiting quietly all along. This shift completes the reframe. What once felt abrupt now feels earned. Silence delayed reckoning, but never erased it. The Quiet War returns wherever it was never finished. And with that recognition, attention moves outward, searching not for dates, but for regions where pressure accumulated most visibly, preparing to follow the trail of resurfaced tension into the landscapes that carried it longest for generations. Shaped quietly before memory, noticed patterns emerging again, without warning across time, place, language, belief, structure, and expectation lingering. The North rarely appears dramatic when history looks back. It does not dominate with iconic battles or decisive speeches. Yet beneath its quiet surface, pressure gathered. Contradictions accumulated slowly there, settling into the land itself. Authority existed without clarity. Freedom existed without agreement. Identity existed without resolution. These tensions did not explode immediately. They waited. Regions, shaped by subtle influence, develop sensitivity. When control is indirect and uncertainty prolonged, small changes carry greater force. The North had lived inside competing expectations for generations. It learned to adapt, to absorb, to endure. That endurance made it resilient, but also fragile. Like stone bent under steady weight, it held pressure until stress traveled outward from elsewhere and returned magnified. As new challenges emerged across the nation, the North absorbed shock first. Questions that seemed abstract in distant centers became immediate realities here. Borders were felt rather than debated. Authority was experienced rather than theorized. When policy shifted or ambition accelerated, its impact surfaced along these older seams. Instability appeared sudden only because the groundwork was invisible. This does not make the region a villain, nor does it render it a victim. A fault line is neither malicious nor innocent. It is created by movement beneath the surface, by forces acting over time. The northern fault line formed through years of quiet management, delayed resolution, and inherited compromise. When pressure increased, it behaved according to its design. Contradictions lingered here longer than elsewhere. Freedom promised broadly met limits applied locally. Unity declared nationally encountered division in practice. These mismatches accumulated without resolution, shaping perception and behavior. People sensed inconsistency long before they could name it. Distrust grew not from ideology, but from experience. Stability elsewhere depended on accommodation here. The land itself reflected this memory. Movement slowed unexpectedly. Resistance gathered in familiar places. Cooperation fractured along lines that felt ancient even when newly expressed. The North remembered what history had softened. Its silence had not erased tension. It had preserved it, holding it in place until circumstance forced expression. This pattern unsettles because it removes randomness from disruption. Instability did not appear anywhere. It followed old seams. Pressure traveled along routes already shaped by earlier decisions. When silence failed, release followed the paths that had been prepared quietly. Geography behaved like memory, directing stress where compromise had settled deepest. Understanding the North this way changes how later conflicts are interpreted. They no longer feel accidental or disproportionate. They appear responsive, surfacing where endurance had been demanded longest. The region became a mirror, reflecting unresolved questions back to the nation when conditions shifted. This recognition deepens unease. If land can remember, then forgetting is never complete. The North carried contradictions forward, storing them until silence lost its hold. It absorbed strain, so stability could persist elsewhere, then revealed that cost when balance shifted. It was in these northern spaces that endurance quietly transformed into expectation. People learned to live with inconsistency, to navigate uncertainty without promise of resolution. That skill proved useful to the nation as a whole, even as it carried cost. Patience replaced participation. Observation replaced influence. Over time, this conditioning shaped political culture, encouraging restraint where confrontation felt dangerous. The land taught caution, and that lesson spread outward, embedded in leadership and law. When fracture finally appeared, it followed these learned behaviors, revealing not rebellion, but exhaustion, from waiting too long for clarity that never fully came, yet was always promised just beyond the horizon, deferred again, quietly, patiently, shaping response before reaction became unavoidable for those watching. Having identified this fault line, the narrative turns toward response. When pressure surfaced and silence was no longer enough, leaders were forced to act within a system shaped by avoidance rather than resolution. How authority responded to visible strain reveals as much about inheritance as intention, guiding the story toward moments when control attempted to reassert itself over fractures it had long ignored. Authority rarely meets history on equal terms. It inherits systems already weighted with compromise, shaped by silence that once kept things moving. When fractures surface, leadership faces conditions it did not create and cannot easily trace. Decisions must be made quickly, often without clear understanding of origins. In these moments, governing becomes management rather than resolution, an effort to contain exposure instead of reopening foundations that were intentionally left unexamined. Pressure reveals limitation. Leaders work within structures designed to avoid conflict, not resolve it. When tension rises, responses favor control. Because control feels measurable, rules can be enforced. Boundaries can be reinforced. Narratives can be tightened. Addressing root tension requires memory, and memory threatens stability. The inherited lesson of the Quiet War lingers here. Silence kept order, so silence feels safer than excavation. This does not reflect ignorance. It reflects habit. Authority learned early that ambiguity could be smoothed rather than confronted. Over time, this practice hardened into instinct. When faced with visible fracture, leaders reached for familiar tools. They strengthened institutions, clarified enforcement, emphasized unity. Each response addressed symptoms effectively, while leaving origins untouched. The pressure eased briefly, confirming the method. Yet, each cycle narrowed future options. The longer causes remained unspoken, the fewer paths remained available. Policy grew reactive. Decision-making favored immediacy over depth. Structural solutions replaced conversation. These measures worked in the short term, which made them difficult to question. Stability returned, but it returned thinner, more brittle than before. The Quiet War's legacy reveals itself here most clearly. It taught authority how to function without transparency. It rewarded restraint, patience, and avoidance of open reckoning. Leaders inherited this playbook without inheriting its context. When stress arrived, they governed with blind spots, addressing what they could see while remaining wary of what memory might reopen. Over time, this pattern reshaped leadership psychology. Exposure became something to manage, not explore. Crisis became an interruption rather than a signal. The goal shifted from understanding to containment. Each response reinforced the idea that control equaled competence. This made authority appear decisive even when direction remained unresolved. The cost of this approach accumulated quietly. Institutions became efficient at absorbing shock, but poor at transformation. Dialogue thinned. Trust relied more on structure than relationship. When confidence faltered, reinforcement followed. The system learned to brace rather than bend. This preserved order while reducing resilience. Viewers may sense familiarity here. Leadership under strain often feels repetitive, cycling through similar responses regardless of circumstance. This repetition is not failure of imagination, it is inheritance. Unresolved foundations limit imagination by narrowing what feels safe to attempt. Authority chooses what has worked before, even if it no longer fits. As pressure increased across generations, each response carried echoes of earlier avoidance. What was not addressed became harder to address. Silence did not disappear, it deepened. By the time cracks became visible, memory felt dangerous. Opening the past risked destabilizing the present, so the present was fortified instead. This is the sobering reveal. Authority tends to manage symptoms because origins threaten coherence. Control feels safer than reflection. Yet every act of reinforcement adds weight to the structure already under strain. Options reduce. Flexibility fades. The future inherits tighter constraints than the past intended. The section slows here, allowing recognition to settle. Leadership did not choose blindness, it inherited it. Systems shaped by quiet war respond predictably under stress, favoring containment over understanding. This pattern does not end conflict, it postpones it, shifting strain forward in time. With authority revealed as reactive rather than restorative, attention naturally moves elsewhere. If leadership struggled to see the pattern it lived inside, others must have sensed it earlier. Some noticed repetition before it hardened into routine. The story turns now toward those voices, marginal and often dismissed, who felt the ground moving long before fractures became impossible to ignore. These voices did not always seek authority or agreement. They observed patterns, sensed imbalance, and recognized delay as danger. Their insights unsettled because they threatened comfort, not because they lacked truth. As silence persisted, such warnings lingered at the margins, waiting for moments when structures strained enough to reveal what patience had concealed for generations to notice finally, without denial or comfort. Before fractures became visible, before pressure announced itself publicly, there were people who noticed something felt wrong. They were not prophets, and rarely claimed certainty. They were observers. Writers who sensed contradictions in language. Regional voices who felt decisions drifting away from lived reality. Thinkers who noticed patterns repeating beneath new names. Entire communities learned to recognize imbalance through experience rather than theory. Their warnings did not arrive with urgency. They arrived as questions, cautions, hesitations, easy to ignore. Systems built for stability do not welcome early signals. They are trained to smooth disruption, not interpret it. When warning arrives quietly, it competes with comfort. It challenges momentum rather than crisis. As a result, early insight often sounds like pessimism. Doubt feels unhelpful when progress appears functional. These voices were not dismissed because they lacked perspective, but because their perspective threatened reassurance. The discomfort they introduced was subtle. They did not predict collapse. They pointed to strain. They spoke of imbalance between promise and practice, between language and experience. Their concerns did not fit neatly into policy or ceremony. They asked for attention rather than action, reflection rather than movement. In a culture oriented toward forward motion, this felt like delay. Many of these warnings emerged from the same regions that had absorbed uncertainty longest. People accustomed to navigating inconsistency develop sensitivity. They notice shifts early. They recognize patterns others overlook. When authority changes tone, when policy narrows quietly, when silence replaces explanation, those living inside such conditions feel it first. Their insight came from proximity, not ideology. Yet proximity rarely grants authority. Early warnings challenge narratives before those narratives are complete. This timing makes them inconvenient. They require pause before damage forces it. They suggest reconsideration when certainty feels necessary. As a result, such voices are often framed as disruptive rather than insightful. They appear to oppose progress simply by asking what progress excludes. The painful reveal lies here. Foresight often looks like negativity until consequence provides context. Societies rarely recognize wisdom in advance. They recognize it after repetition makes patterns undeniable. By then, the cost of ignoring early insight has already settled. What once sounded like complaint becomes hindsight. This pattern reveals how knowledge is filtered through comfort. Systems listen more readily to information that confirms direction than to information that questions it. Early warnings ask systems to reconsider foundations. That request threatens cohesion, so it is deferred. Doubt is tolerated privately, but dismissed publicly. The people who raised these concerns rarely sought recognition. Many spoke quietly, within their communities, through writing, conversation, or local leadership. Their impact was subtle, diffused, difficult to measure. They lacked spectacle. Without crisis, their words faded into background noise. Over time, repetition dulled urgency. Familiarity softened concern into routine. The audience is invited here into a quieter form of empathy. These warnings were not ignored out of malice. They were overshadowed by momentum. Stability has volume. Comfort fills space. Early insight whispers, and whispers struggle against certainty. This reframing changes how wisdom itself is defined. It suggests that societies often recognize understanding only after it becomes unavoidable. Early perception is not rewarded, it is endured. Those who sense imbalance ahead of time carry the discomfort alone, watching patterns form while reassurance continues. The realization lingers uncomfortably. How many insights go unheard because they arrive too early? How often does truth appear impractical simply because it threatens continuity? The Quiet War's legacy sharpened these dynamics. Silence trained systems to value calm over curiosity. By the time warning became audible, direction had already hardened. Once these voices are recognized, even retroactively, another question emerges naturally. If warnings existed, why did they fail to change course? Understanding dismissal requires examining the structures that preferred stability to foresight. The story now turns toward that mechanism, tracing how systems absorb early insight without allowing it to alter direction, revealing why listening is often delayed until listening no longer changes outcome, only understanding of what was already lost, leaving recognition to arrive long after action was possible. And noise becomes signal only when consequence makes silence impossible to maintain any longer. Listening is not simply an act of hearing. It is an act of rearranging priorities. Institutions understand this instinctively, even when individuals do not. Systems are built to preserve continuity, to protect what already functions, and to minimize disruption that could weaken coherence. Within such systems, warnings that arrive early do not register as guidance. They register as threat, not because they are false, but because they require reopening questions that were deliberately sealed to ensure survival. Acknowledging deep structural tension would have meant revisiting silences that held the nation together. It would have required asking why certain compromises existed, why limits felt natural, and why some questions never fully disappeared. That kind of inquiry does more than challenge policy, it challenges identity. For systems built on inherited compromise, reflection risks destabilization. Listening becomes costly not in effort, but in consequence. This is where dismissal becomes structural rather than moral. Warnings were not ignored because leaders or institutions lacked empathy. They were sidelined because responding would have demanded a form of honesty that threatened cohesion. Silence had already proven effective. It had allowed the nation to move forward, to expand, to stabilize. Reopening unresolved foundations risked slowing momentum or fracturing agreement. From within the system, that risk outweighed uncertainty elsewhere. Institutions are rewarded for continuity. Stability validates leadership. Calm reinforces legitimacy. When early warnings suggest imbalance, they introduce friction without offering immediate resolution. They ask for pause rather than progress. In a framework that equates movement with success, pause feels like failure. As a result, listening is delayed until disruption becomes unavoidable. The unsettling reveal here is subtle. Systems can recognize truth and still choose silence. Awareness does not guarantee response. Knowledge does not automatically alter behavior. When truth threatens structure, structure often prevails. Stability becomes its own justification. The system survives, even if underlying tension deepens quietly. This dynamic explains why early insight rarely reshapes direction. Warnings are filtered through existing incentives. If responding requires abandoning familiar tools, the system resists. It reframes insight as inconvenience, dissent, or distraction. Over time, this reframing feels reasonable. It protects coherence, it maintains order, yet it also postpones reckoning. The Quiet War taught this lesson well. Silence worked, ambiguity preserved balance, influence endured without confrontation. These outcomes reinforced the belief that questioning foundational compromise was unnecessary. Over generations, this belief hardened into habit. Listening became conditional. Insight was welcomed only when it aligned with continuity. This does not mean institutions are incapable of self-reflection. It means reflection often occurs after cost, not before. Systems adjust reactively rather than preventively. By the time warnings are validated, action has already narrowed. Understanding arrives when change becomes more difficult, not less. The audience is invited here to feel unease rather than judgment. Dismissal was not cruelty, it was preservation, yet preservation carries consequence. Each ignored warning adds pressure to what remains unresolved. Each delay deepens dependence on silence. Over time, silence stops feeling like choice. It feels like necessity. This is how structures endure contradiction. They absorb discomfort without addressing origin. They smooth surface tension while allowing deeper strain to persist. Listening is postponed until outcome forces recognition. At that point, listening no longer redirects course. It only explains how the course was set. The reason no one listened lies not in individuals, but in architecture. The system was doing what it had learned to do: protect stability, minimize disruption, preserve narrative. In that context, warnings were not wrong. They were dangerous. Dangerous to identity, dangerous to coherence, dangerous to momentum. Understanding this reframes failure. It was not a collapse of morality, but a triumph of structure. The system succeeded at surviving its own contradictions. Yet survival is not resolution. The cost of choosing silence over insight accumulates slowly, out of view, until it demands expression elsewhere. With dismissal understood, the story cannot remain theoretical. Choices carry weight. Ignoring warnings did not make tension disappear, it relocated it. The final step is to examine the cost of this silence, tracing how postponed reckoning surfaced later in ways far more disruptive than early listening ever would have been. Recognition rarely arrives with clarity at first. It emerges slowly, after strain has already altered what could have been changed. In those moments, societies begin to understand what earlier warnings were pointing toward, not because insight sharpened, but because consequence made denial impossible. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence reveal themselves as structure. What felt inconvenient becomes obvious. Yet by the time recognition settles, the conditions that allowed choice have narrowed. Understanding arrives not as guidance, but as explanation for damage already spreading. Regret is present, but muted, arriving quietly, without urgency, too late to change direction or restore lost ground. This belated recognition does not erupt dramatically. It settles like weather after damage is done. Systems built around silence do not collapse when truth becomes visible. They absorb it. Acknowledgement arrives carefully, framed by language that limits responsibility while confirming inevitability. Early warnings are remembered differently now, stripped of urgency, converted into lessons rather than signals. What once invited response now invites reflection. The quiet war surfaces again here, not as story, but as consequence, shaping outcomes long after memory fades. Its presence alters trust, expectations, and decisions without ever asking permission to return or announcing itself clearly to anyone. Once systems harden around silence, correction becomes nearly impossible, not because solutions vanish, but because the cost of change multiplies. Altering course now threatens stability that depends on accumulated avoidance. Recognition without capacity for correction deepens fracture rather than healing it. Understanding arrives into structures unable to respond without harm. What might have been adjusted earlier must now be endured. The result is not collapse, but strain spread across generations. Institutions continue operating, yet feel heavier, slower, and more defensive with each repeated cycle of response. Pressure accumulates quietly beneath familiar routines and practices that once promised stability and reassurance. The unsettling realization lies here. Recognition feels productive, even responsible, yet it often arrives too late to matter. Acknowledging truth, without acting on it, creates its own distortion. It converts responsibility into reflection and action into commentary. The Quiet War's legacy reappears at this stage as consequence, not memory. Structures respond as designed, containing disruption rather than dissolving its source. People experience effects without context, inheriting strain they never chose and cannot easily name. This delayed clarity satisfies curiosity while leaving conditions unchanged. It explains outcomes but cannot reverse their consequences or restore pathways already closed by earlier decisions made. Recognition can even intensify division. When understanding spreads without solution, frustration hardens. People know something is wrong but cannot touch its source. Debates become circular. Responsibility disperses. The past feels present yet unreachable. This tension reshapes trust, encouraging suspicion without offering repair. The Quiet War persists here, not through secrecy, but through consequence, pressing against institutions no longer equipped to respond. Understanding becomes weight rather than relief. Knowledge without movement, clarity without capacity. This is how belated wisdom deepens fracture rather than healing it. Pressure continues accumulating, seeking future moments of expression when silence can no longer contain it fully. The section closes without urgency. Recognition settles slowly, heavy and unresolved. There is no call to action here, only awareness of sequence. When understanding arrives after structure hardens, it does not liberate. It clarifies limits. The Quiet War teaches that timing matters. Insight delayed becomes explanation, not choice. This realization lingers, preparing the ground for a deeper reckoning. History moves forward, carrying this weight, inviting contemplation rather than reaction. The story turns now toward the present, where inheritance is felt rather than remembered, and consequence remains unfinished for everyone. With that awareness, the narrative steps forward in time. The focus shifts from events to environment, from decisions to inheritance. The past no longer sits behind the present, it surrounds it. Living inside unresolved history becomes the next question, not as accusation but as condition. The Quiet War is no longer distant. It becomes internal, shaping expectation, debate, and reaction without introduction. This final understanding opens the way for what follows, where reflection replaces revelation and prepares the audience for synthesis rather than shock. A story that never fully ends, only changes perspective as attention deepens into present experience itself. No generation begins with an empty surface. People inherit more than stories and dates. They inherit arrangements made under pressure, choices shaped by fear and compromise, and structures built to survive moments long forgotten. These inheritances do not arrive as instructions. They arrive as environment, as borders that feel permanent, as institutions that feel natural, as habits of thought that seem obvious because they have always been there. The Quiet War in the North lives on in this way, not as a memory passed down deliberately, but as an invisible framework that continues to hold the present in place. Decisions made when uncertainty was high settled into law, practice, and expectation. Over time, their origins faded. What remained felt like reality itself. The past did not retreat into history. It sank beneath it, becoming the ground people stand on without noticing. This is why certain debates feel familiar, even when their language changes. People sense repetition, not because societies fail to learn, but because they are navigating within boundaries designed long before they arrived. Authority, autonomy, expansion, restraint. These tensions return again and again, not as mistakes revisited, but as conditions inherited. The framework shapes what can be imagined, what feels possible, and what feels dangerously unrealistic. Living inside old decisions means responding to limits that no one alive remembers choosing. Institutions behave according to rules shaped by earlier compromise. Borders carry meaning beyond geography. Habits of caution or control persist long after their original purpose disappears. People adapt to these structures instinctively. They argue within them, push against them, accept them, often without recognizing them as historical artifacts. The structure feels present, not past. This continuity is intimate. It shows up in how trust is given or withheld, how authority is questioned or accepted, how uncertainty is tolerated. These patterns feel personal, yet they are inherited. They formed slowly, shaped by conditions that required survival over reflection. What once protected stability now defines behavior. History does not follow individuals as a story. It holds them quietly, influencing response before thought. The unsettling part lies here. When foundations remain unresolved, they manifest not as lessons, but as constraints. People feel frustration without context. Debates intensify without resolution. Certain solutions feel unthinkable, not because they are wrong, but because they challenge inherited structure. The past remains active, shaping choice without needing to announce itself. It does not demand belief. It simply exists. This perspective softens blame without removing responsibility. No generation chose these conditions, yet each lives within them. Awareness becomes the first shift, not action. Recognizing inheritance explains why progress often feels slower than ambition, why change meets resistance that feels disproportionate. The resistance does not come from the present alone. It rises from layers beneath it. The Quiet War's legacy is present in how systems prioritize stability, how silence remains attractive, how control feels safer than uncertainty. These preferences did not appear randomly. They were learned responses to earlier vulnerability. Once learned, they became habits. Habits became culture. Culture became environment. Each step distanced behavior from its origin, while preserving its influence. The audience is guided here not toward judgment, but recognition, to feel continuity instead of distance. The present is not separate from the past, it is built within it. The questions people argue about today echo older tensions not because history refuses to move on, but because structure moves more slowly than language. Change occurs on the surface, while foundations remain steady. History, then, is not something left behind. It is something lived inside. It holds societies by shaping the space in which choices occur. Understanding this does not remove constraint, but it reveals it. And revealing structure changes how movement within it is understood. The next step is not to ask who decided these things, but how people navigate systems they never chose. How freedom operates inside inherited boundaries. How agency feels when environment does most of the deciding. If history is inherited as environment, then behavior makes more sense. Conflict feels less surprising. Continuity feels less accidental. The Quiet War does not haunt the present like a ghost. It supports it like a foundation, bearing weight silently, shaping movement, holding everything in place. And once that is seen, attention naturally turns to how people live, move, and adapt inside these unseen limits, negotiating freedom within structures they did not design, yet must inhabit every day. Freedom is usually imagined as open space, as the absence of barriers, as the ability to move without resistance. Yet most movement in human life does not happen in empty fields. It happens along paths already shaped, guided by lines that are rarely visible. These lines do not announce themselves as restrictions. They feel like common sense, like practicality, like the natural order of things. The legacy of the Quiet War lives here, in this subtle framing of freedom. Choice exists, but it unfolds within corridors inherited long before anyone currently living began to choose. People make decisions every day, believing those decisions to be entirely their own, unaware of how many alternatives never appear as options at all. Freedom is present, but it is directional. It flows more easily in some directions than others, not because of force, but because of familiarity. This is why frustration often feels confusing. People sense resistance without knowing where it comes from. Effort increases, but progress slows. The obstacle does not feel like opposition. It feels like reality pushing back. Limits rarely feel like walls. They feel like how things simply are. The Quiet War's influence shaped this experience, teaching generations how to move inside bounds that were never explicitly drawn. Invisible limits are powerful because they require no enforcement. When boundaries feel natural, compliance feels voluntary. Individuals adjust expectations without recognizing adjustment as loss. The environment does the work. Institutions, habits, and assumptions align to guide behavior gently but persistently. Choice remains, but range narrows quietly. This produces a particular kind of discomfort. People sense that something is possible, yet inaccessible. Ambition persists, but direction feels constrained. Solutions that challenge structure feel unrealistic, even when they are imaginable. The tension does not arise from a lack of freedom, but from contact with an unseen boundary. Without visibility, frustration turns inward. Doubt becomes personal rather than structural. The calm tone here matters. This is not an argument against agency. People act, adapt, and influence outcomes every day, but agency operates within context. Awareness of context changes relationship to choice. When boundaries are unseen, people blame themselves for resistance that originates elsewhere. When boundaries are noticed, struggle becomes intelligible. The philosophical reveal emerges gently. Awareness expands freedom, not by removing limits, but by revealing them. Ignorance preserves comfort because it reduces friction with reality. Knowing where boundaries exist invites discomfort, but also clarity. It transforms confusion into orientation. Movement becomes intentional rather than accidental. Late at night, this idea settles differently. It does not provoke urgency. It invites reflection. How many frustrations are encounters with inherited structure rather than personal failure? How often does effort stall because it presses against lines no one remembers drawing? The Quiet War created many of these lines through compromise and silence. They persist not as commands, but as conditions. Freedom within invisible lines is still freedom. People make meaning, form relationships, and create change inside these spaces. Yet the experience shifts when limits are acknowledged. Choice feels less mysterious. Resistance feels less personal. The past loosens its grip slightly, not by being erased, but by being seen. This recognition does not demand action, it demands honesty. Understanding environment changes how freedom is felt, even when environment remains unchanged. It creates space between self and structure, allowing people to distinguish effort from obstruction. That distinction is subtle but powerful. The question that follows naturally is quiet and unsettling. If invisible limits shape experience, does recognizing them alter anything beyond perception? Does awareness change movement, or does it simply clarify confinement? The story does not rush to answer. It pauses here, holding the tension. Recognition can be liberating or paralyzing. It depends on what follows. Seeing boundaries may expand imagination, or it may deepen awareness of constraint. The outcome is not predetermined. What matters is that the lines are no longer mistaken for nature itself. As this realization settles, the narrative prepares to move again. If freedom operates within inherited corridors and awareness reveals them, the next question is unavoidable. What, exactly, does awareness change? Does seeing structure alter how people live inside it, or does it only sharpen the sense of limitation? The answer is not immediate. It unfolds in reflection, setting the stage for a final reckoning with what knowing can and cannot do. Awareness arrives quietly, without fixing anything. It does not reach back through time to undo decisions or soften their consequences. What it changes instead is relationship. Knowing alters how the past is carried, not what the past contains. This distinction matters, especially here, where silence once protected survival and clarity now reveals structure rather than solution. Recognition does not promise resolution. It promises orientation. When patterns become visible, repetition becomes optional. The quiet war does not need to be exposed like a hidden truth. It needs to be noticed as a recurring logic. Once noticed, it loses some of its power to surprise. It can no longer disguise itself as accident or inevitability. It becomes something remembered through behavior rather than story. This is an uncomfortable honesty. Awareness does not free anyone from limits already built into institutions, borders, and habits. It does not dissolve inherited corridors overnight. Those structures continue to exist, carrying weight accumulated long before recognition arrived. Expecting awareness to fix them creates disappointment. Understanding must be allowed to do its quieter work. That work begins internally. When people recognize patterns, they stop blaming themselves for friction created elsewhere. Confusion gives way to context. Frustration becomes intelligible. The past shifts from accusation to explanation. This change does not remove pressure, but it changes how pressure is interpreted. Instead of reacting automatically, people pause. That pause is small, but meaningful. Awareness interrupts unconscious repetition. Without it, patterns reproduce themselves invisibly, passing through generations unchanged. With it, repetition becomes visible. Choices still occur inside structure, but they are made with perception rather than assumption. This does not guarantee better outcomes. It guarantees fewer automatic ones. The quiet war belongs in this category. It is not a secret waiting to be revealed dramatically. It is a pattern that has been operating continuously, influencing decisions while remaining unnamed. Awareness reframes it as background logic rather than buried scandal. The shift reduces fear and replaces it with attentiveness. Nothing dramatic needs to happen. Something subtle already has. This is why the tone here resists optimism and despair. Neither fits the reality of inherited structure. Hope that awareness will solve everything leads to disillusionment. Cynicism that nothing can change leads to paralysis. Honesty occupies the space between. Knowing does not rewrite history. It changes how history is lived inside. Over time, this shift accumulates. Awareness alters conversation. It introduces patience where urgency once dominated. It creates language for limits that previously felt personal. It allows disagreement without immediate escalation. These changes are not visible on maps or timelines. They occur within perception, slowly shaping response. The past remains present, but it no longer controls interpretation entirely. People see where constraint ends and choice begins. That line is rarely clean, but noticing it matters. Even partial clarity reduces repetition. Even incomplete understanding prevents some mistakes from recurring unconsciously. This is the emotional turn of the story. The goal is not to correct ancestors or assign blame. It is to inhabit the present with clearer sight. History becomes something observed rather than something unconsciously reenacted. The quiet war fades as spectacle and returns as awareness. As this section closes, the focus narrows further. The nation's story has served its purpose. Patterns identified at scale now invite reflection at a smaller level. If history operates through inheritance and awareness alters repetition, then the final question is no longer about borders or institutions. It is about individuals. How do people carry inherited structures inside themselves? How does silence repeat at personal scale? How does choice feel when limits are known rather than invisible? These questions do not demand answers yet. They create space. The story slows, preparing to step inward, where the quiet war no longer belongs to maps or memory, but to thought, habit, and attention itself. Personal reflection completes the movement. What once shaped nations now echoes quietly within daily choices, reactions, and silences. The same patterns that guided borders guide beliefs. Awareness does not command change, but it invites presence. In that presence, repetition loosens. Attention becomes choice. The quiet war ends nowhere, yet becomes something lived with intention, rather than something endured unconsciously again. Awareness continues, patiently, across time. Without demand or urgency, stories remain alive, not because they are retold, but because their patterns continue to operate. History does not reset when generations change. Human behavior carries forward habits learned under pressure, reinforced by reward, and softened by time. Avoidance, justification, silence. These patterns repeat not only at national scale, but within families, communities, and individual lives. The quiet Northern War matters because it reveals this continuity. It shows how unfinished stories persist by becoming normal. At this stage, the conflict is no longer distant. It is no longer something that happened to other people, in other places, long ago. It becomes a mirror. The same impulses that shaped a nation under strain shape personal decisions under stress. Fear of instability, preference for certainty, desire to move forward without reopening old wounds. These impulses feel human, not historical. That is precisely why they endure. Silence feels safe when honesty threatens balance. This is true in private life as much as public life. Difficult conversations are postponed. Unresolved issues are managed instead of examined. Justifications soften discomfort. Over time, avoidance begins to feel responsible. Stability is preserved. Yet beneath that stability, pressure accumulates. What is not addressed does not disappear. It waits. The Quiet War illustrates this dynamic at scale, but the lesson does not belong to the past alone. It explains why certain patterns feel familiar across generations, why institutions hesitate to confront origins, why individuals repeat behaviors they believed they had outgrown. The story matters because it shows how continuity operates without intention. Participation does not require awareness. Silence does the work automatically. This realization is not accusatory. It does not suggest failure or weakness. It acknowledges how humans survive uncertainty. Closure is comforting. Complexity is exhausting. Moving forward feels necessary. The cost of stopping to examine foundations often feels higher than the cost of continuing, so patterns persist. They are inherited quietly, reinforced subtly, and rarely questioned unless pressure forces attention. The relevance of these stories lies in recognition. Seeing the pattern does not demand that anyone dismantle it immediately. It invites awareness of participation. People are not simply observers of history's continuation. They are part of it through daily choices about what to address, what to postpone, and what to leave unnamed. The same mechanisms that preserve national stability preserve personal equilibrium. Late at night, this understanding lands gently. It does not demand action. It offers reflection. How often does silence feel easier than truth? How often does explanation replace examination? How often does forward motion substitute for resolution? These questions feel intimate because they are. The Quiet War becomes a language for recognizing familiar behavior without judgment. This inward turn explains why these stories still matter. They are not warnings about the past. They are descriptions of the present. History continues wherever silence feels safer than honesty. Not because people choose harm, but because they choose relief. The pattern repeats because it works, at least temporarily. Understanding this creates humility. It suggests that large systems and individual lives are shaped by the same pressures. The scale changes, but the behavior remains. Stability is preserved by postponement. Identity is protected by narrative. Wounds are managed by silence. These strategies are effective. They also carry cost. By reframing relevance this way, the story softens. It no longer seeks to convince or confront. It invites companionship. The listener is no longer outside the narrative, evaluating it. They are inside it, recognizing echoes. The Quiet War becomes less about geography and more about psychology, less about nations and more about people. Once relevance is internalized, urgency dissolves. The story no longer needs a conclusion, it needs space. Understanding settles best in stillness, not resolution. The next movement is not toward answers, but toward quiet presence, toward observing how patterns live within thought, habit, and silence. From here, the story slows, preparing to release explanation and guide the listener into reflection, where awareness replaces narrative, and the Quiet War becomes something noticed rather than something endured. continuing softly wherever attention allows it to be seen without fear or demand. There is a quiet comfort in not knowing everything. Uncertainty demands attention, patience, and energy, and most lives are already full. Questions pull at the edges of thought, asking to be held longer than convenience allows. In response, forgetting begins to feel like rest. Silence feels like relief, not as denial, but as shelter. This is where many stories come to rest, not because they are false, but because continuing to hold them feels too heavy. Closure, even when incomplete, offers a sense of peace. It allows people to move forward without carrying every unresolved detail behind them. Forgetting does not always arise from disinterest. Often, it arises from care, from the need to live, to function, to maintain balance in the face of complexity that refuses to settle. The mind simplifies because it must. Complexity demands energy. Most people are rarely given the chance to renew. Societies behave the same way. They narrow narratives not to deceive, but to endure. Constant questioning destabilizes rhythm. Every unanswered question opens space for doubt, and doubt asks for time. Over time, silence becomes familiar. What is repeated feels safe. What is left unsaid fades gently, without confrontation. Peace settles in, not because truth has vanished, but because it has been set aside. The quiet war found protection here. Its complexity made it exhausting to hold. Its ambiguity resisted clean telling. Remembering it fully would have required discomfort without immediate reward. So attention shifted elsewhere. The absence did not feel like loss. It felt like calm. The story continued without it, lighter, easier to carry. This pattern is deeply human. People do the same thing in their own lives. Painful conversations are postponed. Questions without answers are softened into habit. Memory is edited not by intention but by need. What remains is what can be lived with. This is not weakness, it is survival. Silence persists because it works. It allows routines to form. It gives space to breathe. It reduces friction with reality. In a world that rarely slows down, not asking feels merciful. Not remembering feels protective. Complexity retreats into the background, where it can exist without demanding action. There is compassion in recognizing this. Forgetting is not a failure of character, it is a response to overload. Silence does not always signal fear. Often, it signals exhaustion. People and nations alike choose what they can hold. What they cannot is released quietly, without ceremony. The lullaby-like rhythm here is intentional. Understanding deepens when urgency fades. The story no longer presses for revelation. It settles into acceptance. The comfort of not knowing explains why patterns repeat even when awareness exists. Knowing does not always lead to change. Sometimes it leads back to quiet, to the decision to rest. This does not make awareness meaningless. It places it gently. Awareness becomes something carried lightly, not something that demands action at every moment. It exists alongside silence rather than opposing it. Both are human responses to complexity. As this recognition settles, judgment loosens. The audience is not asked to wake up or confront anything. They are invited to notice how often peace comes from simplification, how relief follows forgetting, how silence feels safe not because it is right, but because it is familiar. The pace slows further, the story softens. Comfort is acknowledged without being condemned. This is where trust deepens. People feel seen in their hesitation, their fatigue, their preference for calm. There is no demand here, only presence. With comfort acknowledged, the story prepares to release explanation altogether. What remains is awareness without instruction. The final movement will not ask for answers or action. It will leave space. Space to notice silence. Space to carry complexity gently. Space to let understanding exist without urgency. In that stillness, the quiet war does not end. It simply becomes something observed with kindness rather than fear, resting where attention allows it, no longer hidden, no longer pressing, just present, like a thought that no longer needs to be solved to be understood. Stories are often expected to end with answers, yet history rarely offers that comfort. What feels like an ending is usually a pause where attention shifts and language softens. The quiet war followed this pattern. It did not resolve itself through victory or confession. It loosened its grip on memory and settled into habit, What once required explanation became background. The story dissolved into daily life, shaping decisions without announcing itself. In this way, the past did not disappear. It changed form, moving from event into environment, from conflict into condition, remaining present without demanding recognition or definitive closure here. There is comfort in believing stories conclude, because closure simplifies living. Without conclusions, meaning feels unfinished. Yet, unfinished meaning is closer to reality. The Quiet War became something lived rather than remembered, carried forward through instinct and expectation. Borders felt settled, institutions felt natural, and habits felt personal. No announcement marked this transition. It happened gradually, as repetition replaced recall. What remained was not a lesson, but a pattern. It asked nothing of belief. It required only participation, unfolding each time silence felt safer than inquiry, and continued quietly inside ordinary routines everywhere, without needing attention or explanation ever again. This is why the story resists resolution. Endings suggest separation, as though the past can be placed behind us and left intact. But influence rarely respects timelines. It seeps forward, changing shape to match the present moment. The Quiet War survives as attention, choice, and awareness. Each moment of pause interrupts repetition. Each moment of recognition alters response. Nothing dramatic changes, yet something subtle shifts. The story continues not through events, but through perception, quietly reorienting how experience is interpreted. This movement requires no belief, only noticing what already exists within thought, behavior, silence, time, choice, and shared memory spaces. The invitation here is gentle. There is no demand to agree or to act. The narrative opens space instead of delivering conclusions. Listeners are free to carry what resonates and leave what does not. In this openness, reflection replaces argument. Attention drifts inward, toward patterns felt rather than named. The Quiet War becomes personal, not through blame, but through familiarity. Where silence feels comfortable, history is present. Where questioning feels heavy, structure is at work. Awareness rests alongside life, without urgency, allowing meaning to settle slowly, without pressure or expectation, in the listener's own time, an inner quiet awareness gently. Nothing needs to be resolved for understanding to exist. Complexity can be held without being solved. The Quiet War no longer asks to be explained, it asks to be noticed. In noticing, repetition loosens. Habits soften. Silence becomes visible rather than automatic. This does not dismantle structure, but it changes relationship to it. People live inside patterns, yet they are not identical to them. Awareness creates distance without separation, closeness without control. A quiet shift that continues without announcement across moments. Generations, thought, feeling, memory, and attention shaping response, even when unnoticed entirely in ordinary daily experience for everyone involved. This ending remains open because openness mirrors reality. Stories conclude on paper, but life continues elsewhere. The Quiet War transforms into awareness that moves without destination. It neither commands nor convinces, it simply persists, subtle and patient. The absence of instruction is intentional. Listeners are trusted with their own noticing. Reflection does not require resolution. Meaning emerges through attention. The story fades from words into space, where silence finishes what explanation, cannot holding questions gently without demand for closure or certainty, allowing understanding to exist alongside unknowing, as time moves quietly forward beyond endings, conclusions, answers, statements, and final declarations. The most powerful stories do not end because they do not need to. They linger as perspective, as a way of seeing rather than a lesson to learn. This story releases itself into that space. Nothing is asked. Nothing is concluded. What remains is awareness, light enough to carry, quiet enough to rest. The Quiet War dissolves into attention, where it belongs. The final movement is silence. Not absence, but presence. And in that presence, the story continues without sound, without instruction, without ending, remaining open across time and personal reflection until listening itself becomes the conclusion. Felt internally, words,